Hey everyone, welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Bacasa. This week we have Martin Gerdin on the line. Martin is a very unique character in our guest speakers. In the fact that Martin, one, you've been fly fishing since your kids started conventional. You moved into fly fishing after becoming sober, and that was 3 years ago. It's something to be very congratulatory, I guess I could say, about. It's an amazing accomplishment. But along the way, you were a glass blower, took some time off, obviously, when you were having your difficulties. But you've been doing that since you were 12 years old. And you now have 18 years experience of blowing glass. And in particular, you blow glass fish, salmonoids, saltwater fish, etc. And they are absolutely stunning. I have expressed to you personally how impressed I am because I did a little bit of glass work. I couldn't believe how difficult it actually was. So you're what I would consider a master. I'm not sure if you consider that yourself, but pretty amazing work. And then what we're going to do on this call today is talk about some of the local fishing that you've been doing on the Roaring Fork and Frying Pan Confluence area, and your true passion of high alpine lakes and seeking out native fish in different areas. So we'll get a bit with that. We're going to wrap up the show with some commentary on your perspective on how to adjust to the ecosystem, which I think is really important because some people do get kind of rooted in their own ways and don't know how to adjust. It's always a great thing to add to your repertoire of moves. So Martin, welcome to the show. I'm super glad to have you on board and can't wait to share this class experience with the rest of the group. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's fun to be on.
Yeah. So, I've taken a look at some of your glass work. As you mentioned, you started when you were 12 years old. You were quite young and then got into some apprenticeships. And tell us a little bit about how I would say, confluence between your addiction and soberness and the glass played together. I think that's a unique approach for us to kind of take on this.
Yeah. So it's kind of three stories that confluence into one. It's, the mental health struggles, the passion for fishing, and also the drive to work with my hands. Addiction is more of a symptom of mental health issues than anything else. And, when I was young, I was, like you said, I was 12 and I was kind of skipping a class, and I heard this classical music coming from the shed, and I kind of peeked my head in. There was this older guy, making these clear flowers out of glass, which it takes about 20 seconds, and he starts with a ball of lava, and moments later it's a flower so hot that it puts off its own light, and he puts it in the oven. And 12-year-old me, my mind was blown. No pun intended.
Yeah.
I had never seen anything like it. And from that moment, I spent every free moment I could in that studio. And, fishing has always been part of the picture. My mom, grew up in Minnesota, and we had a conventional fishing background. We didn't have a TV growing up. We had dirt bikes, ATVs, and, fishing poles. And we lived up in the high Rockies. I was born in Aspen, and I still live in that area. And what we would do in the summers is, my dad would load up the truck with the kids and my mom and the poles, and we would go up onto the ski mountains actually to cut firewood from all the trail clear. And there were these little snowmaking ponds that they would stock rainbows in. And so that was, my first sort of fishing exposure. And it, up until I got sober, really, I thought every trout looked like that. A pellet head with a little mouth. And, I thought they capped out at about 14, 15 inches long. And, so that the fishing was always an underlying tone through anything we did, whether it was a raft trip on the Lower Colorado, or if we went to visit family in Europe, or whatever we were doing, I always, found a way to incorporate fishing into that.
Okay.
Um, so
It,
when I was really starting to pick up some skill in glass blowing, it was a very natural marriage of the two. My
okay.
mentor, it took a lot of convincing for him to let 15-year-old me make the first fish, but he didn't know what he was starting when he agreed.
Right, right. So you were an apprentice under a master glass blower. Is that typically the process? I mean, it sounds like a traditional kind of process in many ways.
Yeah, it's more in line with the traditional Italian process, like what they used to do for hundreds of years, like in Venice in
Hmm.
particular. Where the young kids would get apprentice and they would kind of do slave labor essentially, cleaning the studio, learning from the masters, assisting them with pieces, um, until eventually they built up enough skill that they could start doing their own thing.
Hmm.
But in these days, most people find glassblowing in college. It's they have like an art elective, and they pick up a glass one class, and they essentially have the same experience that I did when I was 12. Where they see this magical material and process, and
Right.
they're hooked. So I really had a leg up on the competition in a way. Starting so young,
Yeah.
which is pretty uncommon these days.
So when you went to university for the glass art, were you quite a bit ahead of the class that you were in?
Yeah, yeah. When I showed up there, I was 18-year-old kid, and I'm actually 6'9".
Oh wow.
So all the seniors in the program kind of looked at this bearded young giant, that picked up a blowpipe and already could do the things they'd been studying for years. Um, I was when I got to college, I was on par with most of the seniors that were about to be graduating with glass degrees.
Okay.
Um, and to a certain degree that went to my head, and that definitely contributed to the downward spiral.
Okay.
um,
Yeah. So you did you struggled. You had a downward spiral for how many years? You had said.
um, Probably about a decade.
Okay.
um, I'm 30 now, and I've been sober. It was 3 years this past Saturday. um, and
Congratulations,
it's
man.
thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a big deal. I went out with all of my friends last night, and we had this big meal. And um, what's cool though is my circle now is comprised completely out of sober people, which is a big part of what it takes to get as far as 3 years.
Yeah.
um but yeah, anyway, my sort of the slow motion train wreck started, like a lot of people's normal experience with substances. You might try pot, and then you might try beer, and you're like, oh, this is fun sometimes. But in my brain, I had that first joint and that first beer, and my brain clicked, and I was like, this is now the solution to every problem I might ever face.
Ah.
And the issue is it worked for a number of years.
Right.
If you're sad, you drink. If you're happy, you celebrate with a drink. If you're, any emotion, alcohol was the answer. Until
Yeah.
the choice gets removed from the situation.
Right.
And then suddenly I found myself in a situation where if I didn't drink, I would have seizures. And
Right.
um, and I was really trapped for a long time, and I was still blowing glass throughout that period. But I was so sick that I couldn't really accomplish very much. I maybe go in a couple times a week and make a handful of cups and sell it at a craft show.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but I had lost the vision. Um, I had always, ever since I made the first fish when I was 15, that's always what I wanted to do, was like explore this, pretty wild world of sculpting animals.
Yeah.
Um, and the addiction just removed that from the equation completely.
Let's talk about that first fish. What was that?
It was a little clear catfish, probably about 6 inches long. Um, and yeah, like I said, I was 15, and I begged my mentor for what seemed like ages to let me make it. And glass blowing is very there's a very structured way that people learn. It's
Okay.
unlike clay or metal or painting, where you can kind of use your intuition to figure out, if you have some paint in a canvas and you say, I want to paint a fish, it's pretty straightforward on how to get there.
Mm-hmm.
But glass behaves in ways that it almost does exactly the opposite of what you're trying to make it do. Um, and so it was 3 years before my mentor actually let me attempt it. And it was a, goofy little cartoon um, looking catfish. And I sold it for $50, and to a 15-year-old, that was a big deal to me at the time. I
Yeah.
was like, holy smokes, I can like buy a video game and get a smoothie.
and a pizza.
Yeah. um yeah,
That's
and then
awesome.
from that point on, the fish were always like a passion project. If I had an extra weekend day in the studio, or when I was still in high school, I worked for Dave was the guy's name. He was this older guy, and always wore these bright orange sweatbands, and drove this cool Toyota. And like, as a little kid, I thought he was like the coolest dude ever, because he just literally melted glass in his shed all day. But I worked for him during the summers, um, and he didn't pay me. He paid me in blow time. So he would
Oh
let
yeah.
me take glass out of the furnace and like practice and mess around with stuff. And so that's where the clear catfish evolved into sort of more stylized tropical fish. Um, and then I had the idea to make a trout, and it was my mom still has the thing. Actually, it's
Ah,
Pepto Bismol pink, and like bright neon green, and black spots all over it. But I thought all trout looked like stocked rainbows. So
right, right, right. Wow. So you've made quite a bit of progress. Actually, there's a fish on your desk behind you. It's hard to see. Would you mind grabbing that and just bringing it to the
yeah,
camera so we can see that in a little more detail? This is something you've more recently created, right?
yeah, this one was about 6 months ago. Um,
Okay.
and it actually sat on a shelf in my studio for quite a while, because like glass has a lot of chemistry and physics involved, and
Mm-hmm.
this was meant to be a lake trout. You can kind of see by the dorsal fin,
Oh yeah.
but
Okay.
a chemical reaction happened where there's actually spots all throughout, but they disappeared somehow, and the gray turned purple. um,
Ah.
and I
Okay.
wasn't quite sure why it happened. But this piece is actually destined to be a trade for some tattoos from my mom and I.
Ah. Very cool. Very
Yeah,
cool.
which is always fun to do with the ones that don't come out, exactly how I want them to be. I often hang on to them until somebody says, "Oh, I love that." What,
Yeah.
like, let me buy that one, or I
That's the
love
one I
trading.
want. Right. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I love trading with other artists too.
Yeah. Very cool. Very
Um,
cool. So yeah. And while you're putting that back, Martin, um, what is the best way to see your art and potentially take a look at it for purchase or just for your our entertainment? I mean, these guys surely would love to see some of your art.
Yeah, well, I would say Instagram is the best place to go. I
Okay.
post quite a few videos on there,
Yep.
both of the hot process and of the finishing process, and making each piece. It's I kind of develop a relationship with each one because I'm with them for weeks.
Yeah.
It's designing, then I make the fins, I make the eyes, and then there's a big day with the whole team that we put it together, which is the most exciting part to watch. And a lot of those videos on Instagram are of that day. And then there's a number of days where I cut and polish in my home studio and make a stand for it. Um,
Okay.
and
What's your Instagram address?
It's Martin underscore Gerdin underscore glass.
So Martin Martin underscore Gerdin Gerdin underscore glass.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
All
and when
right.
you look me up, my profile picture is the head of a glass tiger trout we made.
Oh, okay. And
That
then
is actually,
it's martingerdinglass.com is your website.
yep.
Okay. All right. We'll get that in the show notes too, so you guys can. So that's martingerdinglass.com if you want to check it out there, and then you can link I'm seeing here to all the social sites too. So it's a great place to go.
Yeah, and I love doing custom stuff as well. I've never caught a wild trout um, that look the same as another wild trout that I've caught. So when people come to me with photos of like a particular, like the last one we made was a big like 27-inch female brown
Mm,
that was really light colored and had this alabaster belly. And for me, that stuff is really exciting. Like if you
yeah.
want me to design it, that's fun as well. But when somebody comes to me with a picture of a really unique fish, I view it as both a challenge and a way to experiment.
Yeah. Very cool. That's awesome. I they're just beautiful. I mean, they all have, like you said, their own style. They're all different, etc. Absolutely beautiful. Let's go back to you had said you spent a lot of time. What's the timeline for, let's say, the brown trout that you recently make? Like, how long does that take? How many hours is that?
Well, I can answer that, and when people ask me that, I say I can answer that in three ways. Hours, weeks, or years. Because it takes 18 years of skill to just be able to do it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, if you were to order one, the time frame, from when we actually start making it to when it's ready to ship is about 3 to 4 weeks.
Okay.
Um, that is not including the wait list, which is usually quite extensive. Like right
Yeah.
now, we're back ordered till probably mid-September. Um, and but the amount of actual hours that go into it is probably like in the 30 to 50 range, depending
Yeah.
on how complicated the colors are.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
and
Very cool.
yeah, that happens, over the course of a few weeks because that female brown that I just mentioned is actually still in the oven.
Mm.
Because we put it together and then like glass, the molecules are like really amorphous, which is part of the reason that it shatters in the first place. Like they don't
Mm-hmm.
fit together. And so to kind of counteract that, we anneal it over a long period of time. Like I think we're annealing this one for 5 days,
Mm. Mm.
where it comes down from 1,000 degrees to room temperature. And even sometimes they don't survive that process still. It's
Yeah.
a really like when the molecules contract at around 900 degrees, it's really dangerous for the piece. So we try and let that soak.
Yeah, there's a lot of science behind it, and I'm sure you could go deep dive into the technicality. It's going to go over all of our heads, but it's interesting because I talked to you a little bit about the fishing, and you had mentioned, hey, I think one of the tips we should talk about is how to adjust the ecosystem, and it really came across in our conversation that you take quite a bit of a scientific and detailed approach to your fly fishing as well. So let's jump into some fly fishing. Tell us a little bit about the fishing around your area and what you really enjoy and how you go about that in your world.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll start at the beginning with an anecdote. Um, so uh, when I had freshly gotten sober, I had fly fished before that, but I always thought it was a little silly. Uh, I thought, why fish in a more difficult way when you don't even eat the fish? I had no conception of the reasons people fly fish. Um, but I had just freshly sober, a couple weeks sober, and I found myself in a sober house in a small town in Colorado with 8 guys that all had fly rods, and COVID had just came out, and so the world was shut down, and so we had nothing to do but fish. And it was like February, and they were all going up to the flats on the frying pan just below the famous toilet bowl, which many of
Mm-hmm.
you have probably fished. Um, and I was thinking, um, this is kind of silly. Like we're driving for an hour through a snowstorm to catch, in my mind, a trout meant a 14-inch stocked rainbow.
Yeah.
Um, and so we get out there and they hand me these waders and this fly rod and we end up landing. Um, it was like a 22 plus cut bow, and just like red and green and like a crazy hump on its back. And as we were getting it to the net, the water was actually shallower than the fish was tall.
Oh wow.
And it was that, kind of that moment where I was like, okay, there's something here.
Yeah.
There, I can see why people do this. Um, and from that moment, we were off to the races. We were fresh out of rehab. None of us had jobs. Like, we were all, working a 12-step program. But other than that, like, we had all the time in the world. And so I really got exposed to a lot of different ways to fish in a lot of different places, both from a boat and not.
Yeah.
Um, and I was almost, I was like a blank slate, both in life and with fly fishing. So um, I didn't have like that fly fishing mentor who was like the dry fly guy only, and that's what he taught me, and that's the correct way to do it. And I was exposed to all these different methods of like big streamers and runoff and sink tip lines, and 7'6" 3 weights on little creeks up in the mountains. And um, and so I really learned that uh, there is no single best way to fish. So
Yep.
whenever I'm gearing up to go out, I like to assess what the conditions are. I like to look at the barometric pressure, because that will tell you how um, um, really how far a fish will move to a fly. And that carried over from the conventional fishing days, because when the barometric pressure is really high, it compresses their swim bladder and they're uncomfortable, so they're not going to want to move as far.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so I adjust my activity and behavior to what the ecosystem is doing.
Yeah, and I really love how you mentioned you got into it, and there was just a lot of diversity. You got, a handful of guys. Each one has his own preferred methodologies, and you're just this like sponge, right?
Yeah.
Going out and learning and every day. But you had mentioned to me before, like you guys fished every day for like a long time.
Oh yeah. Yeah. We would fish like 10 hours a day, and we did that for 11 months. And the crazy part about where we live is it's so diverse here. Like, we have the Roaring Fork, which is like your classic freestone, comes out of Independence Pass. And then we have the Frying Pan, which is it's a small bug, crystal clear tailwater.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the Colorado River, right
Yeah.
downstream, which is a huge, big river, big fish, really wide and deep runs. And we also, like, where I live is at 7,000 feet, so it's not that far to get to those 11,000-foot lakes. And when we first started going up there, that's when I really um, started to like wonder why uh, we could only find cutthroats in alpine lakes.
Mm.
And this was like in the first year that I was fly fishing, and I started to do a little bit of research, and I had no idea that rainbows and browns and all of those species aren't supposed to be here. And I started digging into why that is, and why the Colorado River cutthroats are gone, the greenback cutthroats are gone. um, and that you know started an entire journey of learning about all the different species of salmonids, their native ranges, many of which people haven't heard of. Like, people that have been fly fishing for years, I'll be talking about this trip that I'm going to take to try and find these um, exotic fish in their native range. And a lot of people just look at the rainbows and browns and are satisfied with that, but that's
Mm-hmm.
that's not me.
Yeah. That is cool, man. And that really drove your passion. And it sounds like from what you had discussed, the Alpine Lakes is where your heart has ended in a lot of ways of this is what I want to do. I want to find these natives. So talk about that. You had mentioned some of the ways that you're doing research and how you're getting there and things like that.
Yeah, so and the funny part is a lot of these alpine lakes don't have fish naturally.
Mm-hmm.
Many lakes that are that high elevation, were sterile until Fish and Game put the cutthroat back up there.
Yep.
Um, and in a way, that's a way to preserve their genetics, um, because they just get outcompeted. Um, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure.
I got
No, yeah.
sidetracked by.
Uh,
I was
you're,
imagining the lake.
yeah, yeah. That's good. That's good. It shows your passion. I was curious as to, how are you doing the research on where to go? And then you had mentioned you have some ways of getting to some high alpine lakes, et cetera. And are you hiking in, or are you taking a 4x4, et cetera?
Yeah, so a lot of it is hiking. Um, we there's a lot of like Forest Service access roads, that our Toyota can get us up pretty high in the mountains. But I found that the most special fish are when you have to drive where most vehicles can't drive, and then you hike where most people don't want to hike.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like there's some alpine lakes, that kind of run the length of the Continental Divide. That is really the last holdout of like the greenback cutthroat, especially, which is our state fish. I mean, it's on my license plate, and I've never seen one in a river.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when we um, when we went to Jackson Hole 2 summers ago, um, I noticed that I didn't catch a single non-native fish, in the river. It was all fine spotted Snake River cutthroats. Further up, it was all Yellowstone cutthroats and whitefish throughout. And I started asking the Fish and Game people why that is, and they have an extremely aggressive, invasive control program, in Wyoming in general, where they'll microchip, rainbow trout and brown trout, and re-release them, and then tell the public that, hey, there is a brown trout in this river that's worth $10,000 if you bring it to us. Um, and it's programs like that it seems kind of silly, when you say it out loud, that that's what they're actually doing, but the result is a pristine ecosystem with the fish that are supposed to be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of places can take, a leaf out of Wyoming Fish and Game's book to restore the fisheries to what they're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that I found very interesting is, uh, rainbow trout are a dime a dozen here. You find them, in the fork. You'll find them in ponds. You'll find them everywhere. Um, and when I was catching rainbow trout in the Pacific Northwest, last summer, the rainbow trout there felt very different from the rainbow trout here. And I think it's like the concept of that genetic heritage to a
Yeah.
particular watershed. That these rainbow trout, are steelhead smolts that have been their ancestors were spawning in the same river system 1,000 years ago,
Yeah.
versus some trout farm, like hatchery raceway fish, or
Right.
or
Right.
or the brown trout. Like the brown trout are incredible, like they're incredible creatures, but I I have strong feelings about how effective they are at surviving. Because they haven't been stocked in Colorado since the early 1900s, and they are everywhere. Um, and I when I am fishing like in Slovenia, a brown trout feels very different from a brown trout here in the Ring Fork, because I picture this guy on a wagon train, in the 1800s with a bucket full of brown trout fry,
Yeah.
coming here to wreck the cutthroat population.
Right. Right. Yeah, it is there, that whole native scenario. Um, there's a historical attractiveness to it, preservation, right? The whole what could it have been, what should it have been, question comes up, and there's different takes on it. I go back and forth personally, um, but yeah, I love catching natives, and they feel different. Whether it's
Yeah,
just my own mental state, or if it's reality. I'm sure it goes back and forth, but there's nothing like I think catching a native fish in its own environment, and then just envisioning that heritage per se.
Yeah, yeah. Whitefish are a good example of that for me.
Mm-hmm.
I love whitefish, and it's the only native fish that you can find in our local rivers.
Mm.
I think they're great. They're kind of funny looking, but the fact that they're still here means that there's still hope for this watershed.
Yeah.
Um, and as humanity progresses in general, I feel like we're getting much better at understanding what we should and shouldn't be doing to cause more damage. Um, like I don't think there are any northern pike stocking programs anymore.
Right.
Because
Right.
we've learned that what might be fun for us, like if we introduce largemouth bass into a particular system, what might be fun for us to catch ends up having huge negative effects that snowball down the line.
Yeah.
um, and there's a documentary called Invasive that's about the Yellowstone cutthroat and the lake trout in Yellowstone Park. And I watched that in my first year. When I started digging into why you can only find cutthroat in alpine lakes here, and it snowballed to a point where the baby elk were being exterminated by the grizzly bears.
Hmm.
Because lake trout had outcompeted the cutthroat.
Hmm. Yeah, the trickle effects are amazing. We saw that a lot with when carp were introduced to a lot of lakes and reservoirs, etc., for um, weed bed uh, abatement, basically, right? And then it's all of a sudden carp populations through the roof, and everything else is gone because there's no food source for the panfish, whatnot, etc. So, yeah, it seems like we're learning along the way, hopefully on the right path to not making those same mistakes. So we'll see from there. But you go. We're going to go back to the Alpine Lake scenario. You're going to these Alpine lakes. What kind of research are you doing ahead of time, or are you more kind of just going, "Hey, I'm finding the location. I wonder if there's fish in there. I'm going to go check it out."
Yeah, it's a lot of that. I find that the more information I can find online about a particular lake, the worse it is.
Hmm.
Uh, and Google Earth is a big part of how I find the lakes. Is I'll start with like a Forest Service road, that I know goes up to high elevation. Look to a spot where our Toyota can't make it anymore, and then kind of look in a 10-mile radius from there, of what lakes I can find. Um, and that's it's really exciting too. Exploring, because when you're looking at something from a satellite image, you have no concept of what it's actually going to look like when you're on the ground, um, or whether it's going to be a good place to camp, or whether there's even fish there in the first place. But it is so rewarding to go on an expedition like that and end up finding a lake with like genetically pure Colorado River cutthroat.
Yeah.
And I might only catch a few of them on the whole trip, like maybe 3 10 to 12 inch cutthroat, but those three fish feel infinitely more rewarding and special than a 20-inch rainbow, um, that's in a river or something like that.
Yeah. Something that's non-native. You know.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's jump into this last little bit. You talked about how to adjust the ecosystem, and I think it's quite applicable because you're going to these alpine lakes. You don't know much about them, and you get there. Maybe you're spotting fish, maybe you're not, etc. Let's talk a little bit about some of the approaches you have to adjustment.
Yeah, so I feel like observation is key. That's sort of my first step. When I was first getting sober, I did a lot of meditation, and I would meditate at the river,
Mm.
and that's kind of where the whole concept of just when I get to an alpine lake, I'll sit there, try and find a good vantage point and try and see what the fish are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then that gives me a huge amount of information on how to proceed, like if they're eating chronomids or if I see a rise every once in a while. And then also trying to track down exactly what they might be eating. Like using my baseball cap to try and catch what's flowing low over the water, or looking in the grass to see if I can see pine beetles or grasshoppers or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then once I've sort of done my reconnaissance and information gathering, then I'll try and fish in a way to sort of match what the fish were already doing before I got there.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I feel like that philosophy can apply to almost any situation.
Yeah. There's a lot of parallels between your glass blowing and it seems like your approach to fishing. I mean, you did observation and apprenticeship for a long time in glass blowing, and then it seems like really applying those same techniques in your fishing. Is that a fair assessment? And
Yeah, definitely.
maybe talk about that.
There's more parallels than appear at first glance. Like one of the big parallels I think between fly fishing and glass blowing is we can't actually touch what we're doing, which is pretty a strange concept. Like we're using these tools and this equipment to interact with something that we're disconnected from. Like I can't touch the glass with my hands,
Yeah.
for obvious reasons. In the same way, I can't, touch a fish in a lake until I've done all the necessary steps. So sort of acting, influencing something from afar through devices and tools. And as far as like the mentorship goes, the guys in the sober house, definitely taught me the basics. Um, but I've done a ton of exploring in my own fishing, and as you can see, I tie my own flies.
Mm-hmm.
I got this big, basically a fly shop in my office here, um, and in glass, it's much the same way where I've kind of sort of reached the level of what people can teach me, and it's up to me to explore. Like there's no book that I can go buy that says here's how you make a 30-inch glass brown trout and make it look realistic. That book doesn't exist. Like I'm sort of wandering through the dark here, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but either way, I'm learning from my mistakes and my successes along the way.
Yeah. In fly fishing, I've often isolated different areas and hyper focused on them. So, for example, I might go, I'm going to go out and I'm only going to fish this type of rig. Say it's uh, a dry fly, and I'm only going to fish a parachute Adams for 2 weeks because I really want to figure out how to utilize that as a tool. Do you do that in your glass blowing as well? Like, okay, I'm going to spend time. I'm only going to work on the lower jaw of how to manipulate that glass, or I'd be interested to hear kind of some of those things.
Not necessarily. I feel like there's not really a good way to get to the lower jaw without doing everything else first.
Mm-hmm.
Because the size and the scale and the thickness of the glass and the colors that are inside of it really affect how it moves, because they're all metal oxides and some absorb heat at different rates. So I feel like if I were to try and practice just making like bottom jaws or top jaws, or it would almost be like practicing with that parachute Adams in a parking lot,
Yeah. Okay.
where like you might like, learn some things, but it wouldn't translate into the real deal very well.
Hmm.
In glass, you kind of got to do it to do it.
Yeah. Okay.
Like when we set out to make a fish, we're in for the ride, whether it ends up on the floor or not.
Yeah. Right.
And there's some things like the fins are a really good opportunity to practice and try different things, because I do pre-make all of the fins usually the night before.
Mm.
Um, and so like when I'm trying to experiment with new colors and stuff, trying to figure out how that's going to interact with the heat and the clear glass, and the physics behind each new color. I'll often make a handful of fins out of whatever color I'm trying to test.
Okay.
um,
Okay.
which gives me some idea, but then again, it's totally different when when you have a whole fish on the blowpipe.
Yeah, I'm sure. Let me ask you this: what have you learned in the glass blowing side and taking to your fly fishing and vice versa? What have you kind of taken from the river back?
Discouragement doesn't help anybody. So I feel like all of these things that I'm really into doing are incredibly difficult. Like glass blowing is it's one of the most difficult activities I've ever tried, and fly fishing is no easy feat either. um you know if I feel like any sane person would give up glass blowing early on. um and so the that kind of trained me to um handle the disappointment of failing at fishing many times, until I got the hang of it. And even still, it's like it all doesn't work out right. Like we were
That's
down
right.
in Arizona in March, and if you guys look at my Instagram, you'll see it. We were making this Lahontan cutthroat, and like the size of the world record one was actually the fish that we were making. And so this piece of glass, is the size of a middle schooler. And I had this team of 10 people. And you'll see us all in the video. We're all, running around and making it happen. And right at the end, the whole thing snaps in half, just clean in half. Um, but I'm almost glad that it happened, because I learn more when things go wrong than when from things go right. Whereas it's very similar in fly fishing. It's like I struggled with knots when I was first starting,
Hmm.
and I never knew how close to losing a fish I was until you lose the fish. If you get a fish to the net, you never know if you're not almost failed. But
Right.
when those knots fail, then that gives you parameters for improvement.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas discouragement doesn't help anybody. If I had said, "Oh, well, I better not tie my own knots and have Justin tie all my knots from here on out," or if I had said, "Oh, well, I guess we just can't make Lahontan cutthroat that big,"
Right.
that doesn't help anybody. It's like dissecting why things happen and how to improve them in the future is a
Yeah.
much better
Testing
approach
them.
than discouragement.
Yeah, and the testing them is key too, right? I mean, it's like you fish 6X tippet, a lot around here in my local stream, 6 and 7X, and I'm like, well, if I get a fish on and I can get a glance at it, and I know it's not something I'm like die hard to get in, and I'm gonna horse that thing because I want to see how far I can horse it before I can, break that tippet. And I remember when I first started doing that, and I was amazed at what kind of pressure you could put on a fish in 6X tippet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then, next time I had a good fish on 6X, I was much more calm. I was prepared for what I needed to do to, bow the rod or, let them run, etc. So I love how you learn from mistakes in so many ways, and they can be inspirational too. I mean, your life story, right?
Yeah, and it's all building blocks. Um, where the glassfish, what you see now, it didn't just happen when I got sober.
Mm-hmm.
It was, let me try this. Oh, that worked. Let me try this. That smashed the piece. And
Mm-hmm.
over thousands of little tweaks and tips from other people and brainstorming, and that's how we get to where we are. It's like we're building on our own accomplishments and our own knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
um, and sometimes we have mentors, which accelerates the process, because we can learn from their mistakes, um, without experiencing it ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Martin, it's been great having you on the show, man. I learned a ton today. really different thing to talk about with the glass blowing. You are opening this studio in Jackson Hole, and congratulations on that. We'll get some people up there to definitely swing by the studio when you're ready there. Let us know. We'll make an announcement. And then, if you guys want to get a hold of Martin, it's martingerdinglass.com. Go check out his art. Yeah, man, thanks for being on the show and sharing your story.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, we'll see you next week, and get your line tight. Bye.